On August 15th, 1945, the day following Japan's formal surrender, a wave of jubilation swept across the United States. Church bells joyfully tolled, factory whistles pierced the air, and in Times Square, uniformed young men embraced strangers in spontaneous celebration. Yet, far removed from the exuberant headlines and the cheering crowds, German women held captive sat in somber silence, listening to the fading echoes of a war that had finally drawn to a close. For those branded as adversaries, the triumphant sounds of victory, for one side, resonated with a profoundly different weight. Their guns had fallen silent, but the gnawing uncertainty about their fate had only intensified. A single, pressing question loomed large. What would America decide to do with them now? Among these internees were women barely into their 20s. Many had once been farmers' daughters, diligent factory workers, or unassuming clerks, forcibly conscripted into uniform or swept up unwillingly by the Reich's immense war machine. They had been transported across the Atlantic months prior, their faces still etched with the paleness of seasickness, their gazes instinctively shying away from the rank insignia on the uniforms of their guards. Back home, they had been indoctrinated with the belief that capture meant only starvation, profound humiliation, and an even worse fate. Propaganda had relentlessly portrayed America as a desolate wasteland of crime and utter chaos, a nation solely governed by insatiable greed. Yet, against all these dire predictions, here they remained, alive, adequately clothed, and even provided with warm, substantial meals. It was unsettling, tangible proof that much of what they had been fed as truth was, in fact, a carefully constructed fabrication. The internment camps scattered throughout America were neither idyllic havens nor infernal prisons. Wooden barracks, formidable wire fences, and vigilant watchtowers, all the familiar, stark symbols of confinement, defined their existence. But in stark contrast to the pulverized ruins of Cologne or Dresden, these compounds seemed almost merciful. The women ate bread soft as fresh clouds, savored coffee sweetened with sugar, and were handed bars of soap whose sharp, clean scents lingered pleasantly on their skin, a small luxury in a world of deprivation. Letters occasionally arrived through the Red Cross, though often months late, bringing fractured fragments of a homeland crumbling into dust. The paradox was a heavy burden, to be prisoners in a land of such extravagant abundance, while their families languished, starving amidst the rubble of their homes. On the morning of Japan's surrender, a small group of women gathered outside their barracks, their faces tilted toward the horizon, as if the very sky might reveal the mysteries of their impending future. The news, filtering through in hushed whispers from the guards, some smiling with visible relief, others merely shrugging, confirmed it. The war was finally over. For the first time in years, no bombs fell, no sirens wailed their chilling warnings, and no soldiers barked orders to take cover. Yet, true freedom did not arrive with this newfound silence. Instead, the central question sharpened with agonizing clarity. Would they be repatriated to a country reduced to rubble, or would they be held indefinitely as bargaining chips in a nation they barely understood? It was then that a sergeant, his accent thick with the languid drawl of Texas, uttered something almost beyond belief. "Some of you," he announced, "will soon see New York City." The words hung in the air, dissipating like smoke. New York. The very name was a myth whispered even in Germany, a place of towering skyscrapers and endless, dazzling lights. The women exchanged uncertain glances, suspicion hardening their features. Surely, it was a cruel jest. Surely, it was just another calculated manipulation. How could captives ever be permitted to walk freely in the very beating heart of their enemy's empire? But the Americans were unequivocally serious. It was part of a re-education initiative, the officials patiently explained, a program designed to offer the defeated enemy a tangible glimpse of what democracy truly looked like. Not through dry lectures or persuasive leaflets, but directly in the vibrant streets, in the gleaming storefronts, and in the everyday lives of ordinary people. The strategy was as peculiar as it was audacious. To disarm with an overwhelming display of abundance. To teach through sheer, bewildering shock. One of the women, whose name was carefully redacted in later reports, pressed her lips tight, attempting to summon what little pride she had left. She had come of age in Hamburg, where nights routinely ended with firebombs raining from the sky. Her last vivid memory of home was her mother's kitchen, scorched and reduced to cinders, the air thick with the acrid smell of soot. She had imagined America as no better, perhaps even worse, a land equally scarred and desolate. And yet here she stood, in a camp where the children of the guards sometimes waved to her from beyond the wire. The thought of stepping into New York, of seeing with her own eyes what she had been indoctrinated to believe was a land of degenerates, both terrified and powerfully tempted her. Rumors, predictably, spread like wildfire through the compound. Some whispered that the Americans would parade them through the city as grotesque trophies, to be mocked and spat upon by hostile crowds. Others insisted it was a cunning trap designed to test their loyalty. Still others dared to hoped that perhaps, for a few fleeting hours, they might be treated not as prisoners, but simply as women again, allowed to walk streets without the perpetual rattle of boots or the blinding glare of searchlights. Night descended upon the camp, and in the enveloping darkness, the women lay restless, each conjuring her own vivid images of what lay ahead. Some dreamed of lights brighter than any firestorm, of shops overflowing with unimaginable food, of laughter untainted by fear. Others saw only impending humiliation, the jeers of strangers who would never forget the swastika. What united them all was the quiet, profound realization that for the first time, the enemy would not be seen through the protective barrier of barbed wire, but face to face, up close. The Americans meticulously prepared their list, choosing names with careful consideration. Those deemed trustworthy, those who had demonstrated discipline, those who could potentially serve as examples. Their escorts would be armed, but discreet, shadowing them in plain clothes. The women would be allowed to walk freely, to observe, perhaps even to touch the city with their own hands. As the day of departure drew near, one of the guards, a young man from Ohio with sandy hair, attempted to ease their palpable nerves. "Don't worry," he said with a crooked grin. "They won't bite." His words elicited no laughter, only tight, strained smiles. Yet beneath the silence, a profound shift had already begun. The women had braced themselves for harsh punishment, for contemptuous scorn, for the full, crushing weight of defeat. Instead, they were being invited, cautiously and conditionally, into the very heart of the victor's world. On the eve of departure, they stood together once more outside the barracks, the horizon glowing faintly with the last blush of sunset. Somewhere far beyond those skies, their homeland smoldered, broken and starving. Somewhere just a train ride away, New York pulsed with vibrant life, seemingly untouched by the ravages of war. The distance between those two disparate worlds was more than mere miles. It was a chasm of perception, of truth and lies, of expectation and stark reality. And now, almost impossibly, they were about to cross it. When the whistle of the train finally came, slicing through the crisp dawn air, a silence fell even heavier than words. The women gathered their few meager belongings, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and profound wonder. Behind them, the camp remained, orderly, predictable, bounded by its familiar wire. Ahead lay the vast, terrifying unknown. The guards gently ushered them forward, their boots crunching on the gravel path, the steel rails gleaming like a luminous path into another world entirely. As the train doors clanged shut with a finality, and the engine roared to life, one woman pressed her hand against the window, watching the camp recede into the distance. Her breath fogged the glass as she whispered to herself, not in defiance, but in utter disbelief. She had been told America was cruel, barbaric, and utterly desolate. Yet here she was bound not for punishment, but for New York City itself. And though the image of barbed wire had not vanished from her mind, the lights of that unseen city already glimmered like a promise too strange, too fantastical, to truly be trusted. The train rattled eastward through a land that seemed to grow larger, more expansive, with every passing mile. Wide, verdant fields of corn blurred into dense forests. Then came towns adorned with white church steeples, their bells chiming in rhythms that felt utterly foreign to ears long tuned to the piercing wail of air raid sirens. The women sat in a quiet awe, some clutching their coats tightly, others leaning against the glass, as if by pressing close enough they could absorb every detail of this bewildering country they had once been taught was savage. Guards sat nearby, not with rifles aimed and ready, but with folded newspapers and steaming cups of coffee. The very nonchalance of it all unsettled the women more deeply than any overt threat would have. They had been meticulously prepared for hostility, not for such bewildering indifference. As the train neared the Hudson River, the very air seemed to subtly change, growing denser, charged with an unfamiliar energy. The water shimmered like polished steel, and beyond its banks rose towering structures unlike anything they had ever imagined. One woman simply whispered, "Huh," as the magnificent skyline of Manhattan unfurled before them, a jagged crown of stone and steel defiantly stabbing at the clouds. In Hamburg, the tallest spires now lay in ruins. Here, buildings stretched indomitably skyward, seemingly untouched by bombs, glinting majestically in the late morning sun. The women stared, their breath fogging the windows, their own reflections pale and ghost-like against the immense, imposing grandeur beyond. Penn Station swallowed them in a crushing wave of noise. The vast concourse thundered with countless footsteps, announcements echoed from unseen loudspeakers, and the rich smell of roasted peanuts mingled curiously with the scent of gasoline and perfume. They kept tightly together, like bewildered schoolgirls on a forbidden outing, while their plainclothes army escorts melted almost imperceptibly into the bustling crowd, their watchful eyes carefully hidden beneath the brims of their hats. For the women, every fleeting glance from a stranger carried an unspoken weight. Some Americans paused, momentarily curious, but most hurried past with little more than a second look. To be ignored was, in its own way, the greatest shock of all. In Germany, they would have braced themselves for jeers, perhaps even stones. Instead, the city simply moved around them as if they were invisible. Broadway became their first true revelation. They emerged from the station into a world alive with a riot of color and clamor. Neon signs hummed. Even in daylight, Coca-Cola, Lucky Strike, their vibrant glow a stark contrast to their gray memories. Theaters promised dazzling musicals with dancers smiling from painted billboards. Cars rolled endlessly, their chrome grills gleaming like polished armor. The ceaseless roar of horns and the urgent shouts of vendors filled the air with a cacophony so utterly different from the haunting silence of the ruins back home. One woman reached for the arm of another, steadying herself as if the very pavement beneath her might tilt from the sheer strangeness of it all. To their left rose Macy's, its vast display windows overflowing with pristine mannequins draped in silk dresses, hats adorned with exotic feathers, and shoes polished until they gleamed. Behind the glass sat towering pyramids of canned goods and imposing stacks of chocolates, displays designed to entice affluent customers, but which to these women looked like the complete rations for entire villages. One of them pressed her hand to the glass, her eyes narrowing as if to confirm this impossible reality. At home, she had traded her last family heirloom for a meager sack of potatoes. Here, food was arranged not for survival, but for ostentatious decoration. The escorts skillfully guided them through the dense crowds, weaving past eager shoe-shine boys, bustling newsstands, and the constant rumble of streetcars. The enticing smell of roasted chestnuts drifted from a vendor's cart. One guard, noticing the women's hesitant, longing stares, purchased a bag and passed it among them. They accepted cautiously, their fingers trembling as they carefully peeled the shells. The taste was warm, nutty, and almost unbelievably sweet. For a brief moment, their eyes softened, as though cherished childhood memories of winters long before the war had miraculously broken through. The further they walked, the more deeply the contrasts etched themselves into their consciousness. In Germany, children scavenged through ruins, their faces hollow with hunger. Here, schoolboys darted across the street, chasing a ball, their joyful laughter echoing against the grand stone facades. In Frankfurt, shop windows had been shattered for years. Here, every pane glittered with an almost obscene abundance. It was not merely that America had more. It was that it seemed utterly untouched, impregnable, as though the war had been a distant, half-forgotten rumor rather than a devastating storm. In Central Park, the women paused by a pond where children gaily sailed toy boats, the sprawling greenery spreading out in soft, calming waves, a world of unexpected tranquility in the middle of roaring streets. For one woman, the sight was simply too much to bear. She turned her face away, tears glistening in her eyes, profoundly ashamed that such pure joy could cut as deeply as grief. Her own young son, left behind in Bremen, had not lived to see the war's end. Here, American children laughed freely beneath a brilliant blue sky, their mothers watching without a trace of fear. The stark statistics, once mere numbers, came vividly alive around them. They had heard whispers from guards in the camp that Americans consumed more than 3,000 calories a day, that cars outnumbered families, that radios and refrigerators were as common as ordinary chairs. But cold numbers on a page could never capture the visceral shock of seeing endless rows of diners where hamburgers sizzled on grills, their savory scent drifting out to the street. One of the women whispered, "So much meat." The guard only nodded, chewing his own sandwich without ceremony. To the women, it felt simultaneously obscene and miraculous. As they moved along Broadway, they began to discern a profound absence, the absence of hatred. A woman in a shop greeted them with a genuine smile, mistaking them for ordinary tourists. A boy offered them a newspaper, neither knowing nor seemingly caring that they bore the implicit mark of enemy status. One of the escorts leaned down and said quietly, "This is what we wanted you to see. Not soldiers, not camps, just life." The words sank deeper into their minds than any lecture ever could. Still, a lingering doubt persisted. Some wondered if this was all a meticulously staged performance, a grand theatrical display meant to impress and perhaps even seduce them. Perhaps the shops were stocked only for today, the smiles carefully rehearsed, the lights brighter because someone in Washington had specifically decreed it so. Yet the sheer, overwhelming scale of it, the endless streets, the millions of faces, the ceaseless hum of machinery and human voices, was simply impossible to fake. If this was indeed theater, then it was a stage far larger than any world they had ever known. As evening settled, the neon lights blazed to life, their vivid colors dancing on the pavement slick from a brief, refreshing rain. Times Square glowed like a roaring furnace of light, signs flashing advertisements faster than the women could possibly read them. The crowd swelled, sailors arm in arm with laughing girls, newsboys hawking papers that still shouted of peace. The women stood frozen, their heads tilted back, their faces bathed in the electric glow. For them, this was the pivotal moment when myth and stark reality finally collided. They had been told America was poor, decadent, collapsing under the crushing weight of its own greed. And yet here, before their very eyes, it rose higher, brighter, louder than anything the Reich had ever promised. One of the women whispered, almost to herself, "If this is our enemy, what else did they lie about?" The words drifted into the air, barely audible, but heavy as stone. Around her, the others stood in stunned silence, unable to answer, unable even to breathe. The city roared on, indifferent and vibrantly alive, while within their minds, the ground itself seemed to profoundly shift. Their initial steps through Manhattan were taken with extreme caution, as though the very pavement might reject their presence. The women moved in small, hesitant clusters, their coats buttoned tight despite the late summer warmth, their eyes darting from glittering shop windows to the faces of strangers, desperately trying to gauge what this newfound freedom truly signified. Freedom. It was too vast a word for the conditional liberty they now experienced. Their escorts, dressed in civilian clothes but unmistakably soldiers in their disciplined posture, walked at a measured distance. They did not bark orders, nor did they clutch their weapons. Their presence was both subtly invisible and undeniably palpable, a constant reminder that the leash had merely been lengthened, not completely removed. Yet, for the women, even this fragile illusion of liberty was utterly overwhelming. They passed a fruit stand where plump oranges gleamed like small suns in a rustic wooden crate. One of the women slowed, instinctively drawn by the vibrant color, and stared until the vendor caught her eye. Without a moment's hesitation, he lifted one perfect orange and pressed it gently into her hand. She flinched, startled by the unexpected gesture, then looked to her escort for approval. The guard shrugged with a faint, reassuring smile. She raised the fruit to her nose, inhaled its sharp, sweet fragrance, and whispered something in German that her companions understood immediately. I had forgotten the smell of the world. Every block confronted them with another jarring contradiction. They had been told that Americans were brutal conquerors who would revel in their suffering. Yet here, a shopkeeper tipped his hat politely. A little girl giggled innocently as she pointed at their heavy coats. And a policeman directed bustling traffic with nothing more threatening than a simple whistle. The women found themselves disarmed, not by overt hostility, but by the sheer, bewildering indifference of the people of New York. They were simply another thread in the endless, intricate fabric of the city, and that, more than any display of abundance, shook them to their very core. To be treated as utterly ordinary after years of relentless propaganda that declared them monsters felt almost more unsettling than being hated. In a small, bustling diner, the group was invited to sit for lunch. The booths were lined with plush red leather. The jukebox played a lively swing tune, and the air smelled deliciously of fried onions and rich coffee. Plates of hamburgers arrived, their soft buns overflowing with crisp lettuce and thick slices of ripe tomato. After the meal, they walked again, drifting toward the serene expanse of Central Park. The trees swayed gently in a soft breeze, their leaves glinting with captured sunlight. Couples strolled arm in arm. Children rolled hoops along the winding paths, and old men played chess at tables shaded by ancient elms. One of the women sat on a bench, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She watched a boy chasing pigeons and felt an ache so deep it threatened to utterly undo her. In Bremen, children picked through ashes where pigeons no longer roost. She pressed her lips together, determined not to cry in front of her captors. Yet, when a toddler tripped and was lifted gently by his loving mother, her shoulders began to shake uncontrollably. The sight of such ordinary tenderness here was almost unbearable when measured against the desolate void of home. The numbers, cold and precise, have been reiterated countless times in the camp. Americans consumed more than 3,000 calories a day. Their factories poured out cars by the millions. Their homes were filled with radios and refrigerators. But mere numbers could never describe the way an ice cream cone dripped deliciously down the fingers of a laughing girl, nor the way vibrant jazz music spilled from an open window, bright and defiantly alive. The statistics carried a certain weight, but the sensory flood of the city possessed a gravity all its own. Even humor found its unexpected place. At a corner, they passed a group of young American women in fashionable skirts and silk stockings. The German women stared wide-eyed until one whispered to another, "They are real stockings." They shared a nervous, almost bitter laugh, remembering the carefully painted lines many German women had meticulously drawn down the backs of their legs when fabric had utterly run out. The absurdity of comparing painted illusions to real silk in a land where such things were plentiful struck them with both a sharp bitterness and a reluctant amusement. For some, suspicion remained firmly entrenched. Perhaps this was all a meticulously orchestrated charade, a grand performance meant to utterly seduce them. Perhaps beyond the bright facades lay the same gnawing hunger and ruin they knew all too well. But as they watched New Yorkers haggle boisterously with vendors, quarrel over taxi fares, and sit on stoops reading newspapers with careless ease, the sheer, sprawling ordinariness of it all felt too vast, too organic, to possibly fabricate. This was not theater. It was life, and life was a force too sprawling and untamed to be merely staged. One woman, older than the rest, carried herself with a quiet dignity sharpened by profound grief. She had lost her husband on the Eastern Front, her home in Hamburg reduced to a pile of unrecognizable rubble. As she walked beneath the blazing neon signs of Times Square, she murmured, "They told us America was collapsing." She looked around at the roar of lights and laughter, the dizzying churn of the crowd, and slowly shook her head. If this is collapse, what then is victory? Her words, heavy with unspoken irony, hung in the air until one of the guards, unable to resist, chuckled softly. Night deepened, and the women eventually returned toward the train that would take them back to confinement. Yet something fundamental had irrevocably shifted within them. The city had not embraced them, nor had it scorned them. It had simply existed around them, vibrantly alive and utterly unbroken. For women who had lived their entire lives beneath the oppressive weight of relentless lies, the shock of ordinary kindness was more transformative than any lecture, any punishment. As they boarded, one woman lingered on the platform, her eyes fixed on the distant skyline, ablaze with light. She pressed her hand against the railing and whispered to no one in particular, "If this is our enemy, then we were blind." Her voice trembled, not with fear, but with a dawning, terrible clarity. Not with fear, but with a dawning, unsettling realization. She finally turned, stepping onto the train, yet her gaze clung to the city until the door slid shut. Behind her, New York continued its indifferent blaze, a vibrant, eternal contradiction to every truth she had ever been taught. The train lurched into motion, pulling them back toward the familiar confines of fences and rules. But deep within their minds, those mental fences had already begun to crumble. For the first time, they had glimpsed a world not of desolation and decay, but of boundless possibilities. As the dazzling lights of New York receded into the vast distance, a heavy, unsettled silence descended upon them, alive with questions too dangerous to even formulate. The train groaned with steel and smoke, severing its connection from the metropolis. For a long while, no woman spoke a word. The city had etched itself too profoundly onto their souls. They sat in quietude, clutching their coats as if to safeguard the vivid memories. Shop windows overflowing with treasures, the spontaneous peal of laughter on sun-drenched sidewalks, the defiant glow of neon lights piercing the night. For years, they had lived by a narrative carefully constructed by others, a grim fairy tale portraying America as a land of chaos, decay, and utter cruelty. Yet, in a single extraordinary day, that meticulously woven story had fractured, and through its widening cracks poured a torrent of questions none dared voice aloud. Back in the camp, the fences suddenly felt impossibly narrower, the very air thicker and more stale. The once familiar rhythm of guards, kitchen duties, and rigid roll calls now seemed utterly inadequate to contain the immensity of what they had witnessed. A few women, in the dead of night, whispered their astonishment, their voices hushed beneath the concealing blankets. One described the taste of a hamburger as if it were a miraculous communion. Another spoke of the children in Central Park, their cheeks rosy with health, their eyes bright with an innocent trust they hadn't seen in years. A third, in a voice tinged with unexpected shame, confessed to feeling envy, a dangerous emotion in a camp where pride had been their only fragile shield. The conflict brewing within them transcended mere hunger or simple longing. It was the agonizing, slow collapse of an entire worldview, the profound realization that the world they had been painstakingly raised to believe in might never have existed at all. The Reich had promised unparalleled strength, an immutable destiny, 1,000-year reign. Yet their own cities lay in ashes, their brothers and husbands buried in foreign soil, their children gaunt with hunger. Across the vast ocean, the so-called enemy strolled freely through streets illuminated like joyous festivals, ate until their bellies were full, and conversed with strangers without a hint of fear. This stark, unbearable contrast gnawed at them relentlessly, a festering wound that could no longer be ignored. Even among the guards, rumors began to ripple through the ranks. Some opined that the women had returned subdued, their defiance seemingly diminished. Others, however, observed a deep restlessness, a perpetual pacing in the yard as if the camp's boundaries had abruptly shrunk and become too constricting. This was precisely the Americans' intent: to destabilize, to shake, to expose the insidious lies of an ideology that had once appeared utterly unshakable. Re-education, some termed it. But for the women themselves, it wasn't the dry lessons on paper that wrought such a profound change. It was the lived, palpable weight of abundance and the unexpected, casual decency shown by strangers. One afternoon, as they scrubbed laundry by the camp's communal water pump, two women engaged in a hushed, fervent argument in German. One insisted, stubbornly, that America remained a land of rampant greed, that its towering skyscrapers were merely monuments to selfishness, not generosity. The other woman shook her head slowly, gripping the wet fabric with trembling hands. "If that is greed," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion, "then how did a stranger hand me an orange?" The silence that followed was far heavier than any shouted lecture, for in that singular, simple gesture, the elaborate myths had unraveled more completely than years of relentless propaganda ever could. The guards began to notice a palpable shift in demeanor during roll call. The women no longer met their gaze with suspicion alone, but with something far more intricate: curiosity, perhaps, or even a tentative, budding respect. A sergeant from Ohio later penned in his report that exposure to American civilian life has done more to alter their convictions than months of confinement. He was not exaggerating. For the women, the vibrant city had become a forbidden image, replaying endlessly behind their eyes. It was incontrovertible proof that the world was indeed larger, richer, and undeniably more humane than the narrow, suffocating frame in which they had been forced to exist. Still, this profound transformation carried its own agonizing pain. Belief in the Reich had, for all its cruelty, provided a stark certainty. To doubt it now was to concede that their suffering, their irreplaceable losses, their unwavering loyalty, had all been utterly wasted. Some defiantly resisted this conclusion, clinging to brittle fragments of pride. Others began to visibly unravel, their nights consumed by restlessness, their eyes fixed desperately on the horizon, as though searching for a truth they had never been permitted to see. "I do not know who I am without the story they told me," one woman confessed quietly to a fellow prisoner. The admission lingered, a silent confession of betrayal, though no guard was near enough to overhear it. The Americans, for their part, did not press too aggressively. They permitted the women to write letters, to attend lectures on democracy, to listen to radio broadcasts brimming with jazz and news of Europe's slow rebuilding. But nothing, absolutely nothing, compared to that brief, transformative walk through New York. It had been far more than a mere tour. It had been a violent collision between two incompatible worlds, one crumbling into ruin, the other ascending with undeniable vigor. And in that shattering collision, myths had splintered beyond any hope of repair. In the months that followed, the women awaited repatriation. Ships would soon carry them back across the Atlantic, not to the Germany they remembered, but to a nation fractured and ruined, starving and occupied. The very thought filled them with an overwhelming dread. How could they possibly describe what they had seen? How could they explain the dazzling lights, the abundant food, the carefree laughter? To speak of it too openly might invite suspicion or outright scorn from those who had endured in silent suffering. Yet, to remain silent would be to deny the powerful truth that now resonated within them. One evening, as the camp quieted to a lull, a guard patrolling the fence overheard singing. The women had gathered, their voices intertwining in a hymn, not of triumph, but of poignant mourning, subtly threaded with nascent hope. The words were ancient, deeply familiar, yet something in the tone had profoundly shifted. They sang, not as prisoners, nor as proud servants of a lost cause, but as human beings who had glimpsed another, radically different possibility. The guard paused, listening intently, and for a fleeting moment, the barbed wire seemed to dissolve into nothing more than thin air. The collapse of a myth is never a thunderous event. It does not announce itself with earth-shattering explosions or piercing sirens. Instead, it arrives like the slow, imperceptible cracking of ice, unnoticed until the dark water beneath is irrevocably revealed. For these women, that collapse had already begun. The elaborate lies of empire could not possibly withstand the overwhelming sight of a city pulsing with light and abundance, nor the simple, honest taste of a meal offered without malice. The Reich had promised them unparalleled greatness, yet it was the very enemy who had, unexpectedly, shown them true dignity. As the ships prepared for their departure, one woman carefully folded her meager belongings into a small, worn bundle. At the very bottom lay the orange peel she had meticulously hidden, now dried and brittle, a fragile fragment of the day her understanding of the world had irrevocably shifted. She traced its contours with her fingers, not as a grim relic of captivity, but as tangible proof of something far grander, that she had once been offered a simple act of kindness by a stranger in a land she had been told would utterly destroy her. When the time finally came to board, the women lined up at the gate, their shadows stretching long against the unforgiving ground. The camp stood grimly behind them. The vast, indifferent ocean lay ahead, and somewhere beyond the horizon, their ruined homeland awaited. But lodged firmly in their minds, burning brighter than any rubble, was the vivid memory of New York, its brilliant lights, its spontaneous laughter, its impossible, ordinary beauty. They carried that memory like a precious spark, hidden but fiercely alive, ready to ignite questions that no chain of command could ever silence. And as they stepped forward, the truth clung to them more tightly, more intimately, than any uniform ever had. The enemy had not starved them, had not mocked them, but had instead shown them a freedom so strange and profound it was almost unbearable. It was a revelation they could not unsee, a weight they could not possibly put down. And though they did not yet fully grasp it, that weight would follow them home, pressing relentlessly against every story, every silence, every enduring scar of the war.